The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkways of Naval Base Coronado as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen walked toward the main briefing hall. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her black hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and her stride confident despite the weight of the classified folder tucked under her arm. At 34, she had learned to carry herself with quiet authority, though today felt different somehow. The base buzzed with its usual activity. Young sailors hurried between buildings, their conversations mixing with the distant sound of helicopter rotors and the ever-present crash of Pacific waves against the shore. Sarah had been stationed here for 3 weeks now, long enough to recognize the rhythms of the place, but not long enough to feel at home. She paused at the entrance to Building 47, checking her watch. The morning briefing wasn't scheduled to start for another 10 minutes, but Admiral Marcus Reeves had specifically requested she arrive early. The message had been brief and formal, offering no explanation for why the commanding officer of SEAL Team Operations wanted to see her. The hallway inside smelled of fresh coffee and the peculiar mixture of salt air and industrial cleaning products that seemed to permeate every military facility near the ocean. Sarah's footsteps echoed off the polished floors as she made her way toward the briefing room. Through the windows, she could see groups of SEAL candidates running drills on the beach, their instructors barking orders that carried on the morning breeze. Admiral Reeves was already in the briefing room when she arrived, standing with his back to the door as he studied a large map mounted on the wall. He was an imposing figure, even from behind, broad shoulders, silver hair cropped military short, and the kind of bearing that commanded respect without effort. At 58, he had spent over 30 years in the Navy, the last 10 commanding some of the most elite special operations units in the world. "Sir," Sarah announced herself as she stepped through the doorway. Reeves turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes taking in her appearance with the practiced assessment of a career military officer. There was something in his expression that Sarah couldn't quite read, not hostility exactly, but certainly not warmth. He gestured toward one of the metal chairs arranged around a conference table that dominated the center of the room. "Have a seat, Commander Chen," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority that came with decades of command. "We need to discuss your assignment here." Sarah took the indicated seat, placing her folder on the table in front of her. The room was spartanly furnished but functional, with maps, charts, and operational photos covering most of the available wall space. A coffee maker gurgled quietly in one corner, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in stark institutional brightness. "I've been reviewing your file," Reeves continued, settling into the chair across from her. "It's interesting reading." He opened a thick manila folder and began flipping through pages, his expression neutral but somehow skeptical. Sarah remained silent, waiting. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, it was better to let the other person reveal their intentions first. "MIT graduate," Reeves read aloud. "Advanced degrees in computer science and cryptography, top of your class at Officer Candidate School, exemplary service record with naval intelligence, commendations for work in cyber operations." He looked up at her. "Impressive credentials for someone so young." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, though something in his tone suggested the compliment was not entirely sincere. "The question is," Reeves continued, leaning back in his chair, "what exactly brings someone with your background to my domain? This is a special operations base, Commander. We deal with real-world missions, not theoretical computer models or intelligence analysis from the safety of an office." Sarah felt the subtle sting of his words but kept her expression neutral. She had encountered this attitude before, the assumption that because she worked primarily in intelligence and cyber operations, she was somehow less of a warrior than those who carried weapons into direct combat. It was a prejudice she had faced throughout her career, particularly from officers in the special operations community. "I'm here on assignment from Naval Special Warfare Command, sir," she said simply. "The details are classified, but I believe you should have received the authorization codes." "Oh, I received them," Reeves said, his tone growing slightly colder. "What I didn't receive was a clear explanation of why I'm supposed to integrate a desk jockey into active special operations planning." The insult was delivered so casually that it took Sarah a moment to fully process it. Desk jockey. The words hung in the air between them, and she felt a familiar flash of anger that she quickly suppressed. She had worked too hard and come too far to let casual disrespect derail her mission. "Sir, with respect, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about my qualifications, she began carefully. Reeves waved a dismissive hand. I'm sure you're very good at what you do, Commander. Computers, codes, intelligence analysis, all important work. But this is where we train and deploy the most elite warriors in the world. We deal with life and death situations that require split-second decisions and absolute physical courage. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the training facilities beyond. My SEALs have earned their place here through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They've proven themselves in combat zones around the world. They don't have time to babysit someone who's more comfortable behind a keyboard than behind enemy lines. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. Admiral, I understand your concerns, but I assure you that I'm fully qualified for this assignment. Are you? Reeves turned back to face her, and now there was open skepticism in his expression. Tell me, Commander, when was the last time you were in a real combat situation? When did you last make a decision that meant life or death for American servicemen? The questions hit like physical blows, and Sarah found herself fighting to maintain her composure. She thought of the missions she couldn't discuss, the operations that would never appear in any official record, the teammates who had died while she made exactly those kinds of life-and-death decisions. But all of that was classified at levels that even Admiral Reeves didn't have access to. Sir, much of my operational history is classified beyond your current clearance level, she said quietly. I can't discuss specifics, but I can assure you that I have extensive field experience. Reeves actually laughed at that, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Classified beyond my clearance level? Commander, I have oversight of some of the most sensitive operations in the entire military. I've been read into black programs that don't officially exist, so please spare me the mysterious spy act. He returned to his seat, fixing her with a stare that was clearly meant to be intimidating. Let me be blunt, Chen. I don't know what kind of political maneuvering got you assigned here, and frankly, I don't care. But I won't have my operations compromised by someone who thinks a computer science degree makes them a warrior. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was worse than simple professional skepticism. This was personal. For reasons she couldn't understand, Admiral Reeves had decided she was a threat to his command, and he was making it clear that her presence was not welcome. Sir, I didn't ask for this assignment, she said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. But I'm here now, and I intend to do my job to the best of my ability. Your job? Reeves repeated, picking up her file again. Yes, let's talk about that. According to these orders, you're supposed to be integrated into our planning for Operation Silent Thunder. That's a high-priority mission involving multiple SEAL teams and assets from across the Special Operations community. He closed the file with a sharp snap. What I want to know is what makes Washington think that a computer analyst, regardless of how fancy her degrees are, belongs in that kind of planning session. Before Sarah could answer, the door to the briefing room opened and two other officers entered. She recognized them from the base directory, Commander Jake Morrison, the executive officer for SEAL operations, and Captain Lisa Rodriguez, the intelligence liaison. Both were accomplished officers with impressive service records, and both looked surprised to see the early meeting in progress. Admiral, Morrison said, glancing between Reeves and Sarah. We weren't expecting to start for another few minutes. We were just having a preliminary discussion, Reeves replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was far from over. Commander Chen was about to explain her qualifications for participating in our operational planning. Sarah felt the eyes of all three officers on her, and she realized this had become some kind of test. The weight of their skepticism was almost physical, pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy pack. She had faced similar situations before, but never with stakes quite this high. Perhaps, she said carefully, it would be better to discuss this in the context of the actual briefing. I believe my role will become clearer once we review the mission parameters. Morrison pulled out a chair and sat down, his expression curious but not unfriendly. Fair enough, though I have to admit, Admiral Reeves has a point about the unusual nature of your assignment. We don't typically get intelligence officers attached directly to operational planning. Especially not ones whose primary experience is in cyber operations, Captain Rodriguez added, settling into her own chair. Don't get me wrong, Commander, that's important work, but this mission is going to involve direct action in some very dangerous territory. Sarah looked around the table at the three officers, all of whom had somehow managed to express doubt about her presence without quite crossing the line into open insubordination. It was a masterful display of military politics, and she found herself grudgingly impressed despite her growing frustration. "I understand your concerns," she said finally, "and I appreciate that my background may seem unusual for this type of assignment. But I can assure you that I didn't request this posting lightly, and neither did the officers who sent me here." "The officers who sent you," Reeves repeated slowly. "Yes, let's talk about that. Your orders come from Admiral Patricia Hayes at Naval Special Warfare Command. I've known Pat Hayes for 15 years, and this kind of personnel decision isn't typical for her." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Which makes me wonder what kind of pressure she might be under to make this assignment. Political pressure, perhaps? Some kind of mandate to integrate more women into special operations." The implication hit Sarah like a slap, and she felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. The suggestion that she was here because of her gender rather than her qualifications was not only insulting, but potentially damaging to her credibility with every officer in the room. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room, "I can assure you that gender politics had nothing to do with my assignment here." "Then what did?" Morrison asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Because the Admiral has a point, this is unusual." Sarah found herself in an impossible position. The truth about her background and qualifications was classified at levels that would require special authorization to discuss. But without that context, she appeared to be exactly what Reeves suspected, an inexperienced desk officer thrust into a role she wasn't qualified for. She made a decision that would change everything. "Admiral Reeves," she said quietly, "before we continue this discussion, I think you should verify my security clearances, all of them." "I've already reviewed your clearances, Commander," Reeves replied dismissively. "Standard top secret with some specialized access for cyber operations, nothing that would qualify you for this type of mission." Sarah shook her head. "Sir, respectfully, I don't think you've seen all my clearances. I recommend you contact Admiral Hayes directly and request my complete authorization profile." There was something in her tone that made all three officers pause. Rodriguez was the first to catch it, her intelligence background making her sensitive to the subtle cues that indicated when someone knew more than they were saying. "Commander Chen," Rodriguez said carefully, "are you saying there are aspects of your background that aren't reflected in your standard personnel file?" "I'm saying," Sarah replied, "that if Admiral Reeves wants to understand why I'm here, he needs to see my complete record, not the sanitized version that gets distributed through normal channels." Reeves studied her face, looking for signs of deception or bluff. But Sarah met his gaze steadily, her expression calm despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. She was taking a calculated risk by pushing back, but she had reached the point where maintaining her cover was more damaging than revealing it. "You're serious," Morrison observed, his tone shifting slightly. "You're actually saying there's classified information about your background that we don't have access to?" "I'm saying," Sarah repeated carefully, "that Admiral Reeves should contact Admiral Hayes and request my complete authorization profile before making any decisions about my fitness for this assignment." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of training exercises and the hum of fluorescent lights. Sarah could see the wheels turning in Reeves' mind as he considered her words. He was experienced enough to recognize when someone was speaking with genuine authority rather than bluffing, and something in her demeanor had clearly given him pause. Finally, he reached for the secure phone on the conference table. "Admiral Hayes' office," he said when the connection was made. "This is Admiral Reeves at Coronado. I need to speak with Admiral Hayes immediately about Commander Sarah Chen's authorization profile." Sarah sat perfectly still as Reeves waited for the call to be transferred. She had just crossed a line that she couldn't uncross, but the alternative was to sit quietly while her reputation and mission were destroyed by ignorance and prejudice. When Hayes came on the line, Reeves activated the speaker function so everyone in the room could hear the conversation. "Marcus," came Admiral Hayes' voice, clear and professional. "I've been expecting your call. I assume you're having questions about Commander Chen's assignment." "That's an understatement, Pat," Reeves replied. "I've got her personnel file in front of me, and frankly, I'm not seeing why you think she belongs on my operational planning team." Marcus, Hayes said with what sounded like barely contained amusement, please tell me you didn't just spend the last hour insulting one of our most valuable assets. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah saw Reeves' expression shift from skepticism to something that might have been concern. Most valuable assets, Morrison repeated quietly. Admiral Hayes, Reeves said carefully, Commander Chen has suggested that there are aspects of her background not reflected in her standard file. I need to know what I'm dealing with here. You're dealing with an officer whose operational record is so classified that even discussing it requires special authorization, Hayes replied. Marcus, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a straight answer. Did you question Commander Chen's qualifications without first reviewing her complete authorization profile? Reeves glanced at Sarah, and she saw the first flicker of uncertainty in his expression. I reviewed what I had access to, Pat. Standard personnel files, service records, security clearances. Standard files, Hayes repeated, and now there was definite amusement in her voice. Marcus, Commander Chen's standard files are covered documentation. Her actual operational record is classified under special access programs that require specific authorization codes to access. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah watched as the realization slowly dawned on the three officers around the table that they had been operating with incomplete and deliberately misleading information. Pat, Reeves said slowly, "What exactly are you telling me?" I'm telling you that before you make any more assumptions about Commander Chen's qualifications, you need to input authorization code Zulu 77 Alpha into your classified terminal and review her actual service record. Rodriguez was already moving toward the secure computer terminal in the corner of the room, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she input the authorization codes Hayes had provided. The screen flickered for a moment, then began displaying information that made her suck in a sharp breath. Jesus, Morrison whispered, reading over her shoulder. Sarah sat perfectly still, watching as the three officers absorbed information that completely recontextualized everything they thought they knew about her. She had spent years building and maintaining cover identities, crafting a public persona that would allow her to operate in various environments without drawing attention to her real work. But now the truth was coming out, and there was no going back. Admiral Reeves, Hayes' voice cut through the stunned silence, I believe you owe Commander Chen an apology, and then we need to discuss Operation Silent Thunder because without her expertise, that mission is going to fail. Reeves slowly turned to look at Sarah, his expression a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and growing respect. The arrogant certainty that had characterized his earlier demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the careful attention of an officer who had just realized he was dealing with someone far more dangerous and valuable than he had ever imagined. Commander Chen, he said quietly, I believe I may have made some incorrect assumptions about your background. Sarah nodded slightly, her expression carefully neutral. It happens, sir. The cover documentation is designed to be convincing. Cover documentation, Morrison repeated, still staring at the computer screen. Commander, according to this, you've been involved in operations that I didn't even know existed. Which is exactly how it's supposed to work, Sarah replied. The question now is whether we can move past this misunderstanding and focus on the mission. Reeves was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him processing not just the information on the screen, but the implications of how he had treated her. He was a career military officer with a reputation for professionalism and competence, and he had just spent an hour insulting and dismissing someone whose operational record far exceeded his own. Commander, he said finally, before we discuss the mission, I think I need to ask you something that I should have asked at the beginning. Sarah waited, curious about where this was leading. What is your actual rank? Reeves asked. Not the cover rank listed in your standard file, but your real authorization level. Sarah considered the question carefully. She had been operating under cover for so long that revealing her true status felt strange, almost dangerous. But Hayes had already opened that door, and there was no point in maintaining the fiction any longer. Admiral Reeves, she said quietly, my operational designation is Obsidian Lion. The effect of those words was immediate and electric. Rodriguez actually stepped back from the computer terminal, her face pale. Morrison's jaw dropped open, and Reeves looked like he had just been struck by lightning. Obsidian Lion, Reeves repeated in a whisper. Sarah nodded, watching as the full implications sank in. Obsidian Lion wasn't just a rank. It was a designation reserved for the most elite operatives in the entire military, officers with authorization levels that exceeded even flag rank for specific types of operations. There were perhaps a dozen Obsidian Lion operatives in the entire military, and their existence was known only to a handful of senior commanders. "Sir," Morrison said shakily, "we just spent an hour telling an Obsidian Lion that she wasn't qualified for operational planning." The humiliation and shock on Reeves' face was complete, and Sarah almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then she remembered the casual dismissal, the assumptions about her gender and qualifications, the suggestion that she was here because of political pressure rather than merit. "Admiral Hayes," Reeves said into the phone, his voice strained, "I think we need to start this conversation over from the beginning." "Yes," Hayes replied, and Sarah could hear the steel in her voice now. "I think that would be appropriate." As the morning sun climbed higher over Naval Base Coronado, Sarah Chen sat quietly in the briefing room and watched three accomplished officers come to terms with the fact that everything they thought they knew about military hierarchy and qualifications had just been turned upside down. The mission briefing was about to begin, but Sarah knew that the real work had already started. Operation Silent Thunder was going to test everyone in that room, but first, they all had to learn to work together despite the dramatic shift in power dynamics that had just occurred. And Admiral Reeves was going to have to learn what it really meant to work with an Obsidian Lion. Part 2, The Weight of Secrets. The secure conference room had been transformed in the 20 minutes it took Admiral Hayes to arrive via helicopter from Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters. Additional computer terminals had been wheeled in. Classified maps were now displayed on wall-mounted screens, and the general atmosphere had shifted from casual morning briefing to high-stakes operational planning. Sarah Chen sat in the same metal chair she had occupied earlier, but everything else about the situation had changed completely. Admiral Reeves now treated her with the careful respect reserved for someone whose authority he couldn't fully comprehend, while Commander Morrison and Captain Rodriguez struggled to reconcile the unassuming woman in front of them with the legendary operational designation she carried. Admiral Patricia Hayes entered the room like a force of nature, her silver hair pulled back severely, and her expression suggesting that someone was about to receive a very unpleasant conversation. At 62, she had spent 4 decades in the Navy, rising through the intelligence ranks to command some of the most sensitive operations in military history. She was also one of only 3 people in the world authorized to deploy Obsidian Lion operatives. "Gentlemen," Hayes said as she took her seat at the head of the conference table, "and Commander Chen, I believe we need to establish some ground rules before we proceed with the operational briefing." Reeves cleared his throat. "Admiral Hayes, I want to apologize for any." Hayes held up a hand, cutting him off. "Marcus, the apology can wait. Right now we have more pressing concerns." She opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a thick file marked with classification stamps that Sarah recognized as requiring special compartmented information clearance. "Operation Silent Thunder is not just another SEAL mission," Hayes began, her tone making it clear that everyone in the room needed to pay very close attention. "It is a joint operation involving multiple agencies and designed to neutralize a threat to national security that most people would find difficult to believe." She activated a wall-mounted screen that displayed a satellite image of what appeared to be an industrial complex surrounded by dense forest. 3 weeks ago, our intelligence assets identified a facility operating in the mountains of eastern Oregon that should not exist. According to all official records, this location is a defunct lumber mill that was abandoned in 1987. Sarah studied the image, noting details that immediately raised red flags. The security fencing was too sophisticated for an abandoned facility. The power lines were too heavy for industrial lumber operations, and the vehicle tracks around the complex suggested far more activity than any legitimate business would generate in such a remote location. "In reality," Hayes continued, "this facility is housing a research operation conducted by a group calling itself the Prometheus Foundation. They've been developing weapons technology using stolen military research and selling that technology to the highest bidder." Morrison leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of weapons technology?" The kind that could shift the balance of power in several ongoing conflicts around the world, Hayes replied grimly. Advanced cyber warfare tools, next-generation explosives, and most concerning of all, prototype directed energy weapons that could neutralize everything from individual soldiers to entire aircraft squadrons. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Rodriguez was the first to speak. How did they get access to that kind of research data? That's where Commander Chen comes in, Hayes said, turning to look directly at Sarah. 6 months ago, her team identified a series of cyber intrusions into classified Defense Department databases. The attackers were sophisticated enough to cover their tracks almost perfectly, but they made one critical mistake. Sarah took over the explanation, her voice steady and professional. They attempted to access historical data about a project I had worked on 3 years earlier. The access patterns were subtle, but they triggered a security protocol I had embedded in the system specifically to detect that kind of intrusion. "You set a trap," Reeves said, his tone suggesting he was beginning to understand the scope of what he was dealing with. "Multiple traps, actually," Sarah replied. "Once we identified the intrusion vector, my team was able to trace the attacks back to their source and begin monitoring their operations. We've been watching them for 6 months, gathering intelligence and documenting their activities." Hayes reactivated the wall screen, this time displaying organizational charts and photographs of individuals Sarah recognized from months of surveillance. The Prometheus Foundation is led by Dr. Marcus Kellner, a former Defense Department researcher who was dismissed 3 years ago for attempting to sell classified information to foreign nationals. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the sight of Kellner's photograph. She had been part of the original investigation that exposed his treasonous activities, though her role in that operation remained classified. Kellner's dismissal had been quiet and bureaucratic, designed to avoid the public scandal that would have resulted from a full prosecution. Apparently, that had been a mistake. Kellner has assembled a team of approximately 40 researchers and technicians, along with a security force of former military personnel, Hayes continued. They've been using the stolen Defense Department research to develop weapons systems that they've already begun selling to terrorist organizations and hostile foreign governments. Morrison whistled softly. "How much damage are we talking about?" "Potentially catastrophic," Hayes replied. "The cyber warfare tools alone could cripple civilian infrastructure across the entire United States. The directed energy weapons could render our aircraft and missile defense systems obsolete overnight." Sarah watched the faces around the table as the full scope of the threat became clear. These were experienced military officers who had dealt with serious security challenges throughout their careers, but even they seemed shaken by the implications of what Hayes was describing. "The mission," Hayes continued, "is to neutralize the Prometheus Foundation completely, destroy their research, eliminate their leadership, and recover any weapons systems that have already been completed." "Rules of engagement?" Reeves asked. "Extremely simple," Hayes replied. "No survivors among the leadership team. The researchers and technicians will be detained for interrogation, but anyone directly involved in selling weapons to terrorist organizations is to be considered an enemy combatant." The room was quiet for a moment as everyone processed the severity of the situation. Sarah had been involved in similar operations before, but she never got used to the weight of decisions that would determine who lived and who died. "Admiral Hayes," Rodriguez said carefully, "this sounds like a job for a full special operations task force. Why is this being handled by a single SEAL team?" "Because," Hayes replied, "the Prometheus Foundation facility is not just a research complex. It's also a fortress designed by people who understand exactly how military special operations work." She activated a new set of images that showed detailed surveillance photos of the facility's defenses. Sarah had reviewed these images dozens of times, but seeing them displayed on the wall screen made their sophistication even more impressive. "Automated defense systems with facial recognition capabilities," Hayes explained, pointing to various installations around the complex. "Multiple layers of electronic countermeasures designed to defeat military communications and navigation systems. Underground bunkers that could withstand direct hits from cruise missiles. And most problematic of all," Sarah added, "the entire facility is designed to be operated remotely if necessary. If they detect an incoming attack, they can evacuate the key personnel and destroy all the research data from off-site locations. Morrison studied the images with the practiced eye of an officer who had planned and executed numerous direct action missions. So we can't use overwhelming force without risking the destruction of everything we're trying to recover. Exactly, Hayes confirmed. This mission requires surgical precision and perfect operational security. Any mistake that alerts them to our presence will result in the complete destruction of everything we need to recover. Reeves was quiet for a long moment, staring at the surveillance images as he considered the tactical challenges they represented. Finally, he looked up at Sarah. "Commander Chen, what's your recommendation for infiltration and assault?" The question was asked with a respect that had been completely absent from their earlier conversation, and Sarah appreciated the professional courtesy even as she recognized the impossible complexity of the mission they were discussing. "The only way to penetrate their defenses without triggering a general alarm," she said, "is to convince their security systems that we belong there. Which means we need to duplicate their access credentials, infiltrate their communications networks, and neutralize their leadership before they realize what's happening." "A cyber attack combined with physical infiltration," Rodriguez observed. "That's why you're here." Sarah nodded. "The plan requires someone who can operate both in cyberspace and in the field, someone who understands their security systems well enough to defeat them and is qualified for direct action against armed opposition." "And that someone is you," Morrison said. It wasn't quite a question, but there was still a note of uncertainty in his voice. Sarah looked around the table at the three officers who, an hour earlier, had been questioning her qualifications for this assignment. Now they were beginning to understand that she wasn't just qualified, she was essential. "Obsidian Lion operatives are selected for exactly this type of mission," she said simply. "We're trained to operate independently in environments where traditional military structures and support systems don't exist." "How many people know about your real background?" Reeves asked. "Including everyone in this room? 15 people worldwide," Sarah replied. "The program exists specifically because there are some threats that can only be addressed by individuals operating outside normal command structures and accountability systems." Hayes closed her portfolio and stood up, signaling that the preliminary briefing was concluded. "Marcus, I need you and your team to understand something very clearly. Commander Chen is not here as a consultant or advisor. For the duration of this mission, she has operational command authority that supersedes normal rank structures." The impact of that statement was immediate and profound. Sarah watched as Reeves processed the fact that he, a flag officer with over 30 years of experience, had just been told he would be taking orders from someone he had dismissed as a desk jockey less than 2 hours earlier. "Admiral Hayes," Reeves said carefully, "I understand the sensitivity of this operation, but I have to ask about the chain of command issues that creates." "There are no chain of command issues," Hayes replied firmly. "Obsidian Lion authority supersedes all other considerations during active operations. Commander Chen will have access to any resources she requires, including the authority to modify or abort the mission if circumstances change." Morrison looked like he was struggling to process this information. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that level of operational authority is usually reserved for general officers or above." "Commander Morrison," Hayes said with what might have been amusement, "Obsidian Lion operatives carry authority equivalent to a theater commander for missions within their specialty area. Commander Chen could requisition an aircraft carrier if she determined it was necessary for mission success." Sarah saw the wheels turning in Rodriguez's mind as she worked through the implications of what Hayes had just revealed. "The Obsidian Lion program," Rodriguez said slowly, "it's not just about elite operatives, is it? It's about individuals who can operate completely outside normal military and legal constraints." "That's classified information, Captain Rodriguez," Hayes replied, but her tone suggested that Rodriguez's assessment was accurate. "What I can tell you is that sometimes protecting national security requires actions that can't be officially acknowledged or legally justified through normal channels." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the full scope of what they were dealing with. Sarah had spent years operating in the shadow world that Hayes was obliquely describing, but she knew that, for most military officers, This level of classified authority was almost incomprehensible. "The mission briefing will continue this afternoon," Hayes announced. "Between now and then, I suggest you all review Commander Chen's operational history and adjust your expectations accordingly." As Hayes gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Reeves cleared his throat. "Admiral, I know this isn't the time or place, but I do want to apologize for the way I handled the initial meeting with Commander Chen. I made assumptions that were completely inappropriate." Hayes paused at the door and looked back at him. "Marcus, in 30 years of military service, you've never encountered anything like the Obsidian Lion program. Your assumptions were understandable if poorly timed." She turned to Sarah. "Commander, I'll leave you to work out the operational details with Admiral Reeves' team. You have full authority to modify the mission parameters as you see fit." After Hayes left, the 4 remaining officers sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares as they tried to reconcile everything they had just learned with their previous assumptions about her background and capabilities. Finally, Reeves spoke. "Commander Chen, I think we need to start over from the beginning, and this time I promise to listen more carefully to what you have to say." Sarah nodded, appreciating the gesture even though she knew it would take time to rebuild the professional relationship that had been damaged by their initial encounter. "Admiral, the most important thing you need to understand is that this mission is unlike anything your teams have encountered before," she began. "The Prometheus Foundation isn't just a group of rogue scientists. They're a sophisticated organization with resources, intelligence, and security capabilities that rival some nation-states. Which is why we need someone with your particular skill set," Morrison observed. "Exactly. But it's also why the mission is going to require a level of operational flexibility that traditional military planning doesn't accommodate. We may need to modify our approach multiple times based on real-time intelligence, and we won't have the luxury of seeking approval from higher headquarters." Rodriguez leaned forward in her chair. "How much modification are we talking about? Are we still discussing a direct action mission, or could this evolve into something else entirely?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The truth was that missions involving Obsidian Lion operatives frequently evolved in unpredictable ways, often requiring actions that would be difficult to explain or justify through normal channels. "Captain Rodriguez, the primary objective remains the same: neutralize the Prometheus Foundation and recover their research. But the methods we use to achieve that objective may need to change based on circumstances we can't anticipate from our current intelligence. And you have the authority to make those changes without consulting with higher command," Reeves said. It was a statement rather than a question, and Sarah could hear the mix of respect and concern in his voice. "Yes, sir, that's exactly what Obsidian Lion authorization means." The weight of that authority settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah had carried it for years, but she never got used to the isolation that came with making decisions that could affect national security without the safety net of institutional approval. "Commander," Morrison said quietly, "what happens if something goes wrong, if the mission fails, or if there are complications?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Then I take full responsibility, and everyone else involved receives whatever protection the government can provide. That's part of what Obsidian Lion authority means. The buck stops with me." As the morning turned to afternoon, Sarah Chen sat in the briefing room at Naval Base Coronado and began the process of planning a mission that would test everything she had learned in 10 years of operating in the shadows of national security. But first, she had to learn to trust 3 officers who had spent the morning learning that everything they thought they knew about military authority and hierarchy was more complicated than they had ever imagined. Part 3, Ghosts of the Past. The secure communications center in the basement of Building 47 hummed with electronic activity as Sarah Chen worked her way through layers of classified databases, cross-referencing intelligence reports, and building a comprehensive picture of the Prometheus Foundation's operations. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, and she had been at the computer terminal for nearly 3 hours, her eyes burning from staring at screens filled with data that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the threat they were facing. Admiral Reeves entered the communications center carrying 2 cups of coffee, a gesture that would have seemed impossible to imagine during their morning encounter. He set one cup next to Sarah's keyboard and took a seat at the adjacent workstation. "Finding anything useful?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Sarah accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "More than I'd like, honestly. The scope of the Prometheus Foundation's operations is larger than we initially thought." She activated a wall-mounted display that showed a network diagram connecting dozens of locations across the United States and several foreign countries. They're not just operating out of the Oregon facility. That's their primary research and development center, but they have distribution networks, financial operations, and communication nodes scattered across multiple continents. Reeves studied the diagram with the practiced eye of an officer who had spent decades analyzing complex military threats. How did they build something this sophisticated without being detected? "By being very careful about compartmentalization and operational security," Sarah replied. "Each node in their network operates independently, with minimal knowledge of the overall structure. Even if we had detected some of their activities earlier, it would have been nearly impossible to recognize the scope of the organization." She zoomed in on a section of the diagram that showed financial transactions flowing through a series of offshore banking networks. They've also been very intelligent about funding. Instead of relying on large payments from a single source, they've built a customer base of smaller clients who purchase specific technologies for specific applications. "Terrorist organizations and hostile governments," Reeves said, reading from the data displayed on his own screen. "Among others," Sarah confirmed. "But they've also been selling to criminal organizations, private military contractors, and even some legitimate defense companies that don't ask too many questions about where their technology comes from." The implications were staggering. The Prometheus Foundation hadn't just stolen military research and developed illegal weapons. They had created an entire shadow economy around the sale of advanced military technology to anyone willing to pay their prices. Commander Morrison entered the communications center as Sarah was pulling up a new set of files, his expression grim. "Commander Chen, we've got a problem," he announced without preamble. "Intelligence just intercepted communications suggesting that the Prometheus Foundation is planning to accelerate their timeline for a major technology transfer." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What kind of technology transfer?" Morrison activated his own terminal and began displaying intercepts of electronic communications that had been captured by National Security Agency monitoring stations over the past 48 hours. According to these intercepts, they're planning to deliver a complete directed energy weapons system to a client within the next week, he said. "The communications don't identify the client, but the financial details suggest someone with access to significant resources." Sarah stared at the intercepted communications, her mind racing through the implications. A directed energy weapons system in the hands of the wrong people could alter the balance of power in any number of regional conflicts around the world. "Do we have any intelligence about the delivery method?" Reeves asked. "That's where it gets worse," Morrison replied. "The communications reference a domestic handoff, which suggests the client is planning to take possession of the weapons system somewhere within the United States." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. A weapons system capable of destroying military aircraft being transferred to unknown parties on American soil represented a threat that went far beyond the original mission parameters. "We need to move up our timeline," she said, already beginning to formulate modifications to their operational plan. "If they're planning a delivery within the next week, we can't afford to spend additional time on reconnaissance and preparation." Captain Rodriguez entered the communications center as Sarah was speaking, carrying an armload of classified files and wearing the expression of someone who had just received very bad news. "Commander Chen, Admiral Reeves," she said, "we've got additional intelligence that changes everything about this mission." She spread the files across a nearby table and began displaying photographs that made Sarah's blood run cold. The images showed the Prometheus Foundation facility in Oregon, but taken from angles and with detail that suggested they had been captured by someone inside the complex. These photographs were taken by an undercover FBI agent who has been infiltrating the Prometheus Foundation for the past 4 months, Rodriguez explained. She managed to transmit them yesterday before her cover was blown. Sarah studied the photographs, nodding details about the facility's internal layout and security systems that would be crucial for planning their infiltration. But something about Rodriguez's expression suggested that the photographs weren't the worst part of the news. "Captain Rodriguez," she said carefully, "what happened to the undercover agent?" "She's dead," Rodriguez replied flatly. "Executed yesterday morning after they discovered her real identity. But before she died, she managed to transmit intelligence that completely changes our understanding of the threat we're facing." Rodriguez activated the wall display and began showing documents that appeared to be internal Prometheus Foundation communications. Sarah read through them quickly, her horror growing with each line of text. "They're not just selling weapons technology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're planning to use it." The communications detailed a plan called Operation Prometheus, which involved using the Prometheus Foundation's directed energy weapons to attack multiple military installations simultaneously, creating enough chaos and destruction to allow for a coordinated strike against civilian infrastructure targets. "The domestic handoff isn't just a weapons sale," Morrison realized, reading over Sarah's shoulder. "It's the delivery of weapons systems to be used in a coordinated attack against the United States." Reeves stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around the communications center as the full implications of what they had discovered became clear. "When?" he asked. Rodriguez checked the documents on her screen. "According to the undercover agent's intelligence, Operation Prometheus is scheduled to begin in 6 days. The weapons handoff is just the final preparation for a coordinated attack that could cripple our military response capability across the entire western United States." Sarah felt the familiar cold focus that came over her during crisis situations. The mission had just evolved from a targeted strike against a rogue research organization to a race against time to prevent a domestic terrorist attack of unprecedented scope and sophistication. "We need to contact Admiral Hayes immediately," she said, reaching for the secure phone on the communications center desk. "Already done," Rodriguez replied. "She's en route and will be here within 2 hours. But, Commander, based on the intelligence timeline, we may not have 2 hours to wait for new orders." Sarah looked around the communications center at the 3 officers who had spent the morning learning to work with someone whose authority and background exceeded their understanding. Now they were all facing a situation that would test everything they thought they knew about crisis management and operational planning. "Admiral Reeves," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came with Obsidian Lion authorization. "I'm implementing immediate mission modification protocols. We're moving to accelerated operational status as of this moment." Reeves nodded, recognizing the shift in Sarah's demeanor that indicated she was now operating under the special authorities that Admiral Hayes had described. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "First, I need a complete assessment of available assets," Sarah replied, already beginning to formulate a plan that would have seemed impossible a few hours earlier. "Personnel, equipment, transportation, and communications capabilities, everything you can deploy on 6 hours' notice." Morrison was already moving toward the secure communication equipment. "I'll contact SEAL team commanders and get a full readiness report." "Captain Rodriguez," Sarah continued, "I need you to coordinate with intelligence assets and see if we can develop additional real-time surveillance of the Oregon facility. Any changes in their activity patterns could indicate that they're aware of our intentions." As the 3 officers began implementing her orders, Sarah turned back to the computer terminal and began accessing databases that would allow her to call in resources from across the Special Operations community. The authorities that came with Obsidian Lion designation were about to be tested in ways that would have consequences far beyond this single mission. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she composed encrypted messages to contacts throughout the government and military establishment. Within minutes, she had requested satellite surveillance, signals intelligence support, tactical air assets, and specialized equipment that would normally require weeks of bureaucratic approval to obtain. The computer terminal chimed softly as confirmation messages began arriving, each one representing resources that were being diverted from other missions and operations to support what was now being classified as a national emergency. Commander Morrison returned from the communications equipment with a grim expression. "Commander Chen, I've got good news and bad news about our available assets. Bad news first, Sarah said without looking up from her terminal. We have exactly 18 SEAL operators available for immediate deployment, along with supporting personnel and equipment. That's significantly less than we would normally deploy for a mission of this scope. And the good news. The 18 we have available are some of the most experienced operators in the entire SEAL community, Morrison replied. If we're going to attempt this mission with limited personnel, these are the people we want. Sarah nodded, still focused on her computer terminal as she continued coordinating resources for the modified mission. Admiral Reeves, she called out, I need to brief you on some operational modifications that are going to seem unusual. Reeves approached her workstation, nodding the classified authorization codes that were appearing on her screen as various government agencies confirmed their support for the mission. Commander, what exactly are you arranging? Assets that don't officially exist for a mission that will never appear in any official records, Sarah replied, finally turning to face him directly. Admiral, what I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that will require you to sign additional security agreements. She gestured toward the wall display, which now showed a real-time satellite view of the Prometheus Foundation facility in Oregon. The image was so detailed that individual vehicles and personnel could be clearly identified. The Obsidian Lion program has access to capabilities that are not available through normal military channels, she explained. Surveillance assets, communication networks, and operational support that exist specifically for situations where normal command structures and accountability systems are insufficient. Reeves studied the satellite image, noting details that suggested surveillance capabilities far beyond anything he had previously been aware of. Commander, how much of the government's actual capabilities have I never heard of? More than you'd be comfortable knowing, Sarah replied honestly. But right now, that's working in our favor. The resources I'm calling in will allow us to monitor the Prometheus Foundation facility in real time, intercept their communications, and coordinate our attack with precision that would normally be impossible. Captain Rodriguez returned from her coordination efforts with intelligence assets, carrying printouts of intercepted communications that were still warm from the secure printers. Commander Chen, we're getting real-time intercepts of communications from the Oregon facility, she announced. And there's something you need to see immediately. Sarah took the printouts and began reading through communications that had been intercepted within the past hour. Her expression grew increasingly grave as she processed the information. They know, she said quietly. Know what? Morrison asked. They know that we're coming, Sarah replied, holding up the intercepted communications. These are internal Prometheus Foundation messages discussing preparations for probable military response and acceleration of defensive protocols. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what Sarah had just revealed. How? Reeves asked. Sarah was already turning back to her computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed databases and communication logs that would help her trace the security breach. Someone with access to our operational planning has been feeding information to the Prometheus Foundation, she said, her voice carrying a cold anger that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Which means we're not just racing against their operational timeline, we're dealing with active sabotage from within our own command structure. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the communications center, Sarah Chen found herself facing a situation that would test everything she had learned in a decade of operating in the shadow world of national security. The mission had evolved from a targeted strike to a race against time to prevent a domestic terrorist attack. And now, she was dealing with the possibility that someone within the military command structure was actively working against them. But she was an Obsidian Lion operative, trained and authorized to operate in exactly these kinds of impossible situations. It was time to find out what that really meant. Part 4, The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. The secure communications center had been transformed into a war room over the past 4 hours. Multiple computer terminals displayed real-time intelligence feeds, satellite imagery updated every few minutes, and communication intercepts that painted an increasingly urgent picture of the situation developing in Oregon. Admiral Hayes had arrived 2 hours earlier, bringing with her additional resources, and the authorization to expand the mission beyond anything originally envisioned. Sarah Chen stood before a wall-mounted display that showed the Prometheus Foundation facility with tactical overlay graphics indicating defensive positions, communication nodes, and potential infiltration routes. But her attention was focused on a smaller screen that displayed something far more disturbing, evidence that someone with high-level security clearances had been systematically compromising their operational planning. The security breach started 3 weeks ago, she explained to the assembled officers. Exactly when I was first assigned to this operation. Admiral Hayes studied the data on Sarah's screen with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades dealing with intelligence failures and security compromises. "Do we have any indication of who might be responsible?" she asked. "Not yet," Sarah replied, "but the timing and scope of the compromised information suggests someone with access to special compartmented information. The breach is too sophisticated to be accidental and too precise to be the work of an amateur." Commander Morrison looked up from his own terminal, where he had been reviewing personnel files and security logs. "Commander Chen, I've been analyzing access logs for everyone who's been read into this operation," he said. "There are only 12 people with the necessary clearances and access to the specific information that's been compromised." 12 people, Admiral Hayes repeated grimly. "Any of whom could be feeding information to a terrorist organization that's planning to attack the United States." Sarah felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling on her shoulders. Identifying security breaches and dealing with internal threats was exactly the kind of situation that Obsidian Lion operatives were trained to handle, but it was never easy to suspect colleagues and fellow officers of treason. "Admiral Hayes," she said, "I'm requesting authorization to implement counterintelligence protocols." Hayes nodded. "Granted, what do you need?" "I need to isolate our operational planning from normal command channels," Sarah replied. "From this point forward, information about this mission doesn't leave this room unless I personally authorize it." Admiral Reeves looked uncomfortable with the implications of what Sarah was proposing. "Commander, that means cutting off communication with our higher headquarters and operating without institutional oversight," he said. "That's a significant deviation from normal operational procedures." "Admiral Reeves," Sarah replied, "normal operational procedures assume that we can trust our own command structure. In this case, that assumption has proven false." She activated a new display that showed communication patterns between various military installations and government agencies over the past 3 weeks. "The security breach isn't just about this mission," she continued. "Someone has been systematically accessing classified information about multiple special operations across the entire Defense Department. The Prometheus Foundation operation is just one target among many." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the scope of what Sarah was describing. Captain Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Commander, are you saying we're dealing with a comprehensive intelligence operation directed against U.S. Special Operations?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Sarah confirmed. "And it's being conducted by someone with access to some of the most classified information in the entire government." Admiral Hayes stood up and began packing around the communications center, her expression indicating that she was processing implications that went far beyond the immediate mission. "Sarah," she said, using the informal address that indicated they were discussing matters at the highest levels of classification, "if you're right about the scope of this security breach, then we're not just dealing with a rogue research organization. We're dealing with a coordinated intelligence operation that could compromise national security across multiple theaters." Sarah nodded. "Which means our mission has just expanded beyond neutralizing the Prometheus Foundation. We need to identify and eliminate the security breach before it compromises additional operations." "How?" Morrison asked. Sarah turned to her computer terminal and began accessing databases that required authorization codes she had hoped never to use. "By using resources that don't officially exist and conducting operations that will never appear in any government record," she replied. She activated a communication channel that connected directly to a facility that none of the other officers in the room had ever heard of. "Raven Base, this is Obsidian Lion 1, she said into the secure microphone. I need immediate deployment of a hunter team for domestic counterintelligence operations. The response came back within seconds. Obsidian Lion 1, Raven Base. Hunter Team Delta is available for immediate deployment. What are your mission parameters? Sarah looked around the room at the faces of officers who were learning about capabilities they had never imagined existed within their own government. Hunter Team Delta, mission parameters are as follows. Identify and neutralize a high-level security breach affecting multiple special operations. Target has access to special compartmented information and is actively collaborating with hostile organizations. Authorization level is terminal. Understood, Obsidian Lion 1. Hunter Team Delta will be on station in 4 hours. Do you require additional support assets? Negative, Raven Base. Obsidian Lion 1 out. Sarah ended the communication and turned to face the stunned expressions of her colleagues. Admiral Hayes, Reeves said carefully, what exactly did Commander Chen just authorize? Hayes looked at Sarah for a moment before responding. She just authorized the deployment of a counterintelligence team that operates outside all normal legal and military constraints. They have authority to investigate, detain, and if necessary, eliminate individuals who pose threats to national security. Eliminate, Morrison repeated. The security breach we're dealing with has already resulted in the death of an undercover FBI agent and is threatening a mission that could prevent a domestic terrorist attack, Sarah said quietly. Terminal authorization means that Hunter Team Delta has the authority to use any means necessary to stop the threat. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Rodriguez was the first to find her voice. Commander Chen, are you talking about assassination? I'm talking about protecting national security using methods that are authorized at levels above anything you've previously encountered, Sarah replied. The Obsidian Lion program exists specifically because there are some threats that cannot be addressed through normal legal or military channels. Admiral Hayes checked her watch and then activated the secure communication system to contact her headquarters. I need to brief the Secretary of Defense about the expanded scope of this operation, she announced. The authorization for domestic counterintelligence operations requires notification at the highest levels of government. As Hayes began her communication with Washington, Sarah turned her attention back to the intelligence analysis that would guide both the original mission against the Prometheus Foundation and the new counterintelligence operation. Admiral Reeves, she said, I need you and your team to understand something very clearly. The mission we're conducting is now operating under authorities that supersede normal command structures and legal constraints. What does that mean for us? Morrison asked. It means that everything we do from this point forward is classified at levels that will follow you for the rest of your careers, Sarah replied. It means that some of the actions we may need to take cannot be discussed or acknowledged outside of this room. And it means that the success or failure of this operation could have consequences that affect national security for years to come. She activated a new display that showed real-time surveillance of the Prometheus Foundation facility, updated satellite imagery revealing increasing activity and defensive preparations. The good news is that we now have access to resources that will allow us to conduct both operations simultaneously, she continued. The Hunter team will handle the security breach while we focus on neutralizing the Prometheus Foundation before they can execute Operation Prometheus. Rodriguez looked at the satellite imagery with growing concern. Commander, the activity level at the Oregon facility has increased significantly over the past few hours. It looks like they're preparing for something major. Sarah studied the images, noting the movement of personnel and equipment that suggested the Prometheus Foundation was either accelerating their timeline or preparing for an imminent attack. They know we're coming, she said, which means we need to move faster than they expect and hit them harder than they're prepared for. She turned to Admiral Reeves with an expression that conveyed both authority and grim determination. Admiral, I'm implementing immediate deployment protocols. We're going operational in 6 hours, with or without complete intelligence about the security breach. Reeves nodded, recognizing the shift in Sarah's demeanor that indicated she was now operating under the full authority of her Obsidian Lion designation. What do you need from us? I need your SEAL teams prepared for a direct assault against a heavily defended facility, Sarah replied. I need tactical air support, extraction capabilities, and communications equipment that can operate independently of normal military networks. Morrison was already moving toward the communication equipment. I'll contact the team commanders and initiate immediate deployment preparations. Captain Rodriguez, Sarah continued, I need you to coordinate with Signals Intelligence and maintain real-time monitoring of all communications to and from the Oregon facility. Any indication that they're preparing to execute Operation Prometheus Early needs to reach me immediately. As the three officers began implementing her orders, Sarah turned back to her computer terminal and began accessing the most classified databases in the entire government. The Hunter team would handle the security breach, but she needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with at the Prometheus Foundation facility. What she found in the classified files made her blood run cold. The Prometheus Foundation's Operation Prometheus wasn't just a terrorist attack against military installations. According to intelligence that had been classified at the highest levels, it was the opening phase of a coordinated campaign designed to destabilize the entire U.S. government. The directed energy weapons were just the beginning. The Prometheus Foundation had been developing capabilities that could cripple civilian infrastructure, disrupt military communications, and create enough chaos to allow for follow-on attacks that could potentially topple the government. And according to the intelligence timeline, Operation Prometheus was scheduled to begin in less than 24 hours. Sarah stared at the classified information on her screen and realized that she was looking at evidence of the most sophisticated domestic terrorist threat in American history. The Prometheus Foundation wasn't just a rogue research organization. It was the operational arm of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military command. Admiral Hayes returned from her communication with Washington, her expression indicating that she had received authorization for actions that she hoped would never be necessary. Sarah, she said quietly, you have terminal authorization for both operations. The Secretary of Defense has personally authorized any actions you deem necessary to protect national security. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what Hayes had just told her. Terminal authorization meant that there were no limits on her authority, no actions that were forbidden if she determined they were necessary for mission success. It was the kind of authority that came with a price that could never be fully paid. Admiral Hayes, she said, I need you to understand that if this mission goes wrong, if we fail to stop Operation Prometheus, the consequences could be catastrophic for the entire country. I understand, Hayes replied, which is why you have been given unlimited authority to prevent that from happening. As evening descended over Naval Base Coronado, Sarah Chen stood in the communications center and prepared to launch two simultaneous operations that would test the limits of everything she had learned about operating in the shadow world of national security. In 6 hours, she would lead a direct assault against the most sophisticated terrorist organization in American history. And somewhere in the darkness, a Hunter team was already moving to eliminate a traitor whose betrayal could compromise the security of the entire nation. The mission that had begun with a simple question about rank had evolved into something that would determine the fate of American democracy itself. Sarah had earned the designation Obsidian Lion through years of training and operational experience that most people would find impossible to believe. Now she was about to discover what that designation really meant when the survival of the nation was at stake. Part 5, Shadows and Revelation. The pre-dawn darkness over the mountains of eastern Oregon was broken only by the faint glow of stars and the distant lights of the Prometheus Foundation facility nestled in the valley below. Sarah Chen lay prone on a rocky outcrop 2 miles from the target, studying the complex through night vision optics while coordinating final preparations for an assault that would begin in less than 30 minutes. The 12 hours since leaving Naval Base Coronado had been a blur of tactical planning, equipment preparation, and the kind of operational coordination that required resources most military officers never knew existed. Sarah had deployed with a team of 18 SEAL operators, supported by assets that included satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, tactical air support, and a Hunter team that was simultaneously conducting counterintelligence operations 3,000 miles away. Raven 1, this is Obsidian Lion, Sarah spoke quietly into her tactical radio. Status report on Hunter Team operations. The response came back through encrypted channels that bypassed all normal military communications networks. Obsidian Lion, Raven 1. Hunter Team has identified the security breach. Target is in custody and being processed. Secondary investigation has revealed additional compromise vectors that are being addressed. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction at the news. The counterintelligence operation had successfully identified and neutralized the source of the intelligence leaks that had been compromising their mission planning. But there was still the matter of the Prometheus Foundation facility and Operation Prometheus, which, according to intercepted communications, was scheduled to begin in less than 6 hours. Team leaders, report status. Sarah called over the tactical network that connected her to the SEAL operators positioned around the facility. Alpha Team in position, came the first response. We have eyes on the main research building and are prepared to breach on your command. Bravo Team ready, reported the second team leader. Perimeter security systems are mapped and we're prepared to neutralize automated defenses. Charlie Team standing by, added the third team leader. Extraction routes are secured and tactical air support is on station. Sarah studied the facility through her optics one more time, noting the increased security activity that indicated the Prometheus Foundation was aware of the impending assault. But thanks to the resources available to Obsidian Lion operations, she had capabilities that their defensive planning couldn't account for. All teams, this is Obsidian Lion, she announced. Mission is authorized. Execute in 30 seconds on my mark. She watched the digital countdown on her tactical display, coordinating the assault with precision that would have been impossible through normal military channels. At exactly 400 hours, she gave the command that would change everything. Execute, execute, execute. The attack began with surgical precision. Bravo Team used advanced electronic warfare equipment to blind the facility's automated defense systems, creating a window of invisibility that allowed Alpha and Charlie teams to breach the perimeter without triggering general alarms. Sarah moved with Alpha Team toward the main research building, her movements fluid and confident despite the weight of specialized equipment she carried. The Prometheus Foundation facility was larger and more sophisticated than even their best intelligence had indicated. Underground levels connected the surface buildings in a complex that extended deep into the mountainside, protected by security systems that represented some of the most advanced defensive technology Sarah had ever encountered. But Obsidian Lion operations had access to countermeasures that were specifically designed to defeat exactly this kind of sophisticated defense network. Alpha Team, we have multiple hostiles in the main research building, reported the team leader as they moved through corridors that looked more like a high-tech laboratory than a terrorist facility. Sarah checked her tactical display, which showed the real-time positions of all friendly and hostile forces throughout the complex. The Prometheus Foundation security personnel were well-trained and well-equipped, but they were facing operators with training and equipment that exceeded anything in their experience. Bravo Team, report on the underground levels, Sarah called as she moved through the research building, documenting equipment and technology that would need to be either captured or destroyed. Underground complex is extensive, came the reply. We've located what appears to be the main computer center and several laboratories with equipment that matches the directed energy weapons descriptions from our intelligence. Sarah reached the main computer center just as Bravo Team was securing the area. The facility was even more sophisticated than she had imagined, with computing power and research equipment that rivaled anything in government installations. But what she found in the computer files made her realize that everything they thought they knew about the Prometheus Foundation was incomplete. All teams, this is Obsidian Lion, she announced over the tactical network. I'm downloading the complete computer files from the main system. What I'm finding here indicates that Operation Prometheus is just one component of a much larger conspiracy.